Hello jelly beans! In today's video, I will be showing you my first impressions of the MIYA/HIMI Jelly Gouache. From what I've seen on Amazon, you can get the gouache in this adorable baby pink, or you can get a cute mint green case. The palette is a thick, sturdy plastic that comes with a removable mixing tray for easy washing, and you could also use the lid as an extra mixing space as well. Each color comes in a 30 milliliter plastic container that looks a lot like a fast food sauce packet or a lot like the Asian jellos that I'd often eat as a kid. My personal favorite was when they had the little lychee cubes in it. And while the gouache claims to be non-toxic, I do not recommend these for eating. The palette comes with 18 colors in total, including 2 whites. I believe one is cool and the other one is warm. I've chosen to keep one closed since I know over time these paints will begin to dry, so I figured I'd preserve one for the future. And to my surprise, the lids were actually pretty easy to peel off and pretty satisfying if I do say so myself. So, as always when I get a new set of paints, I like to swatch all the colors so that I can see what they look like and get a feel for how the paints work. For these paints, I prepared a chart with a black strip using acrylic ink for each swatch so that I could see if the colors were opaque. I did 2 swatches for each color, the top one being straight from the tray and the second diluted with water. Something that I wasn't used to at first was getting a consistent amount of paint on my brush. Typically, when I'm painting with gouache, I squeeze out small amounts of paint onto a mixing palette and I can swipe my brush right against the surface of the palette. With these jelly gouaches, however, since the paints are contained in a tray that are quite deep in depth, I had to delicately brush the surface of the paint with my brush rather than kind of right against the surface, which led me to having too much paint or not enough paint for certain swatches. Overall, though, I really like the color selection that is provided in this set, and I think the 2 whites is actually a really great idea since that's something that I'm definitely going to be using quite often since I typically favor pastel color palettes. And now onto the fun part, the actual demo. After I completed the sketch on the 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, I went in with a fairly watered down layer of the gouache. This allows me to get some color down without losing the sketch, which inevitably happens down the line. Allowing the first layer to dry, I begin to block in the hair, and man, am I in love with this muted purple gray color. This is definitely my dream hair for sure. I mean, parts of my hair is this color, but my roots are turning yellow and I've been too lazy to fix it. So anyway, I can live vicariously through this illustration. At first, for the second layer, I had tried another very thin watered down layer like I do with watercolor, but since this is gouache, it didn't react very well. During the process of this piece, I realized that I had been mostly using acrylic gouache for the past little while, which meant I had to pivot my painting techniques. When using regular gouache like these ones, even when they are dry, they can be reactivated with water. And this can be a good thing when you want to keep using old colors on your mixing tray, but it does mean that you have to be careful about how you layer the colors. So from here on out, I try to only dilute the paint slightly as to not lift layers underneath from having too much water on my brush. Working on this piece, I actually had a really hard time figuring out how I wanted the portrait and colors to look, and I don't think that had anything to do with the quality of the paints. I sort of just jumped right in without a clear plan, and I also hadn't used regular gouache in a while, so it took some time getting used to. Plus, I've been feeling a little rusty overall after the holidays, so I'm sure I would have been having difficulties with any medium at this point. But my general game plan for these earlier stages is to block in the lights and the midtones, figure out where the shadows are going to be, and putting in the warm blush mainly on the nose and the cheeks. A lot of people on my Instagram have asked for gouache tutorials, and while I definitely want to do some, I still feel like my gouache painting process is not quite refined enough for a step-by-step video yet. Honestly, I feel like 75% of the time my gouache painting process is basically me panicking and hoping for the best. Something that I often mention with especially gouache painting is that it will go through a lot of ugly stages before it looks good. Like with this piece, I couldn't seem to decide if I wanted her skin tone to lean warm or cool, and I just kept going back and forth, which is the beauty of gouache. You can keep covering up layer after layer, and so my indecisiveness is enabled with this type of medium. And at this point, even though I was struggling with the colors and values, I had become more comfortable with getting the right consistency with the paint. So for a smooth application, I feel like it's best mixing it with small amounts of water rather than straight out of the tray, because I find that without mixing it with any water, it's like too thick and dry for my personal taste. And speaking of, because the jelly gouache is subject to the open air as you're painting with it, it will begin to dry over time. I think the original intention with these paints is that they would be used for plein air or quick studies, and so presumably the paint would be used up quite quickly. But because of the way that I paint, these paints will probably dry out and lose their jelly consistency before I ever actually use all of the paint. On the bright side though, like I had mentioned earlier, these are water soluble, so even when they dry out, you'll still be able to reactivate them. That may change how they look when you paint with them, but I suppose I shall make another video down the line when that happens and I can show you guys what that looks like. Another thing people often ask me about is how I select my colors. This is another area that I feel like I'm still really working on, but one foolproof way of going about color is, I think, using an analogous color palette. What that means is that you're picking a group of colors that sit next to each other on the color wheel. So in this case, I went for magentas and purples of varying saturations for the majority of this piece. And what this does is creates a feeling of harmony because the colors are from the same family. So when you're mixing your paints, it's good to use the same handful of colors in varying degrees. Like with this piece, even though there's 17 different colors in this palette, I primarily used yellow ochre, magenta, red, violet, and small amounts of blue and black. And of course I used white for pretty much almost all the elements. Another piece of advice I have about my painting process is I think it's beneficial to be working on all the elements of the piece concurrently. The reason for this is because the colors and values will look a little different depending on what is surrounding it. Like when I started adding the darkest parts of her eyes, this makes the shadows of her skin look too flat. And then when I deepen the shadows of her face, the background looks too light. So I think it's good to try and be flexible throughout the painting and don't be too committed or concrete about a certain element when you think it's finished. I think overall it's good to keep fixing, I guess is the word, or keep adding to it if you think it will benefit the piece overall. And like I said earlier, gouache is a pretty flexible medium in the sense that you can keep covering things up if you made a choice that you end up regretting. So you can always fix it generally with more paint. So overall, I actually really liked using the jelly gouache. The first half of this painting, I was ready to set it on fire, but as I mentioned before, that had more to do with me and nothing to do with the actual paints. I tried to find out more information about these paints, but I couldn't seem to find them on the MIYA website. I feel like I've seen through the grapevine that you can buy refills for this palette, but I have a feeling if you don't live in China, it'd probably be difficult to acquire. Also, on the Amazon website, the palette claims to have high quality pigments, but I have a feeling these paints are probably more for quick studies rather than finished professional artworks. So while I definitely plan to keep using this palette, I think I'll reserve it for my sketchbook and not for pieces that I intend to sell the originals of, because I don't think that they're archival in any way. Also, I just want to give a quick shout out to ArtX for sending me these paints. I had been curious about the Jelly Gouache for quite some time, so very thankful to have finally gotten the chance to try them. They sent the paints to me for free. They didn't pay me or sponsor this video, by the way. I just wanted to give you guys my honest review. So if you have been looking to try out gouache but didn't necessarily want to commit to really expensive ones, I do think that these are really fun. And because there is such large quantities of paint, you don't have to feel super precious about them, and in turn, it allows you to experiment and make a mess without the pressure of having it to be a masterpiece because they're professional grade or whatever. Anyways, I hope that this video was insightful. Let me know in the comments if you plan to buy them or if you've already tried these jelly gouaches out yourself, and let me know what you think of them. Anyway, catch you in the next one. Bye!